In the towering, pristine halls of Eastwood Military Academy, Quinn walked quietly through the bustling corridors, blending into the background as she always did. She wasn't a cadet. She wasn't even considered part of the elite circle. To most, Quinn was just another nameless face, a young woman working as a cleaner in the academy, always seen but rarely noticed. Dressed in the standard gray uniform of the custodial staff, she kept to herself, her presence almost invisible. That is, until she walked into the barracks one fateful afternoon. A group of cadets, fresh from their morning drills, were lounging around, laughing and chatting loudly. As Quinn entered with her cleaning supplies, they immediately took notice of her. "Look at this," one of them sneered, pointing at her raggedy uniform. "The great Quinn, here to clean up after us." The others chuckled, their mockery echoing through the room. Quinn's face remained expressionless, as it always did when she was the target of their taunts. She moved to begin her work, but the cadets weren't finished yet. With a sudden movement, one of them grabbed her worn-out bag and tossed it to the ground. "Let's see what she's really hiding in there," the same cadet said, his voice dripping with disdain. The bag spilled open, and the items inside scattered across the floor. A loaf of stale bread, a photo of Quinn as a child with her father, a few crumpled letters and other trivial things, all laid bare for everyone to see. The cadets erupted into laughter, their voices sharp and cruel. "What's this?" another cadet scoffed, picking up the old photograph. "A poor little girl's memories?" The laughter grew louder, more mocking. The cadets thought they had won, that they had exposed Quinn for what they believed her to be, insignificant, unworthy of their attention. But Quinn didn't flinch. She didn't show anger or sadness. Her face remained as neutral as always, even as the jeers continued. She didn't respond to their ridicule. Instead, she simply bent down and began gathering her things, carefully putting them back into her bag. The room was filled with their mocking voices until, out of nowhere, a glint of gold caught the light. A Medal of Honor. It fell from Quinn's bag and landed on the polished floor with a soft but unmistakable sound. For a moment, time seemed to slow. The harsh laughter and cruel words abruptly stopped. All eyes turned toward the medal as it gleamed under the overhead lights. The room, once filled with derision, was suddenly silent. Quinn stood motionless, her back straight, her expression unchanging. It was only then that the cadets realized what they had just seen, the Medal of Honor, a symbol of the highest military achievement. But it wasn't just any medal. This one belonged to General James Carter, one of the most legendary figures in the U.S. military, the first member of the Navy SEALs, and Quinn's father. The cadets, now speechless, exchanged uneasy glances. The weight of the moment hung in the air like a heavy fog. The power dynamics in the room shifted in an instant. No one laughed. No one mocked. The realization that Quinn was not just some insignificant girl, but the daughter of a war hero, began to sink in. Yet Quinn remained unmoved, standing there with a quiet dignity that no one could challenge. The silence that followed was thick with the unspoken truth. The power of the Medal of Honor was undeniable. But for Quinn, the day was just beginning. As the glint of the Medal of Honor lay shimmering on the floor, the room fell into an eerie silence. The cadets, who had once surrounded Quinn with ridicule, now stood frozen, unsure of how to react. Their eyes, wide with disbelief, darted between Quinn and the golden medal. The laughter that had once filled the room was now replaced by an uncomfortable stillness. One of the cadets, a young man named Peter, who had been the most vocal in his mockery, slowly bent down to pick up the medal. He turned it over in his hand, eyes tracing the engravings, and then looked up at Quinn. His voice, once full of disdain, now carried a tone of uncertainty. This belongs to your father?" he asked, his words almost a whisper. Quinn, without a hint of emotion, nodded slowly. "Yes." The room remained still, the weight of the revelation settling in. The medal, once seen as a mere token of military achievement, now carried with it the legacy of one of the most feared and respected men in history. General James Carter, Quinn's father, had been a living legend, his name known in every military circle, his reputation unmatched. For a moment, Peter held the medal, contemplating the gravity of the situation. Then, without another word, he handed it back to Quinn. The cadets who had once ridiculed her now stood in silence, their arrogance fading as they processed the truth about who Quinn really was. But just as the tension in the room seemed to ease, something unexpected happened. The Academy's automated system, which had been running a routine audit, suddenly malfunctioned. The large screen on the wall flickered to life, displaying a set of data that no one was meant to see. The screen was filled with financial records that clearly showed an ongoing case of embezzlement within the Academy. Colonel William Davis, the proud and unapproachable commander of the Academy, was listed as the mastermind behind a massive fund misappropriation scheme. The evidence was irrefutable, and it seemed as though the entire room had just become a witness to something monumental. The cadets' faces went pale as they stared at the screen. Peter, who had been one of the first to notice, slowly turned toward Quinn. His expression was one of shock, but it was clear that the power in the room had shifted once again. The mockery and superiority they had once felt were now overshadowed by the sudden discovery of corruption in the highest ranks of the Academy. Quinn, still calm, stood motionless as the screen continued to display the incriminating evidence. She knew this moment would change everything. What had started as a simple act of humiliation was now something far bigger, a revelation that would bring down the very institution that had long been untouchable. Suddenly, the door to the barracks slammed open, and Colonel Davis stormed in, his face twisted in anger. He had been alerted to the sudden appearance of the financial data, and he immediately recognized the trouble it could cause. "Turn that off," he barked, glaring at the cadets and the screen. "This is none of your business." But it was too late. The truth was already out, and the cadets could no longer pretend ignorance. They had seen the numbers, the evidence of Davis's involvement in the embezzlement scheme that had been draining the Academy's funds for years. As the colonel's voice grew louder, trying to command the room, Quinn took a step forward, her eyes fixed on him. The power dynamics had shifted again, and this time, it wasn't about the cadets or the Academy. It was about justice. "Colonel Davis," Quinn said, her voice clear and unwavering. "You have no power here anymore. Your lies, your corruption, they end today." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Colonel Davis's face turned crimson with fury, but Quinn stood firm. This time, she wasn't just the invisible girl cleaning the floors. She was the daughter of General James Carter, and the truth had found its way to the surface. Before the colonel could react, a group of military officers entered the room, summoned by the undeniable evidence now on display. They were sent to investigate the corruption, and with the revelation on the screen, their mission was clear. Colonel Davis was arrested on the spot, his fall from grace swift and unforgiving. The cadets, once so full of themselves, now watched in stunned silence as the man they had feared and respected for so long was taken away in handcuffs. As the officers led Davis out of the room, Quinn turned to face the remaining cadets. Her expression remained composed, but in her eyes, there was a flicker of something new, something fierce and proud. "You should have never underestimated me," she said softly. The cadets, who had once mocked her, now stood in awe, the respect for Quinn undeniable. They had witnessed her strength, her unshakable courage in the face of ridicule, and her quiet ability to change the course of the Academy's fate. The shift in power was complete. Quinn was no longer the invisible cleaner. She was a force to be reckoned with. As Quinn watched Colonel Davis being escorted from the barracks, a sense of finality settled over the room. The cadets, once filled with arrogance, now stood in stunned silence, the realization of their mistake crashing over them. The air was thick with a new kind of tension, the kind that comes with respect, the kind that can only be earned through actions, not words. The officers who had entered to take Davis into custody turned to Quinn. One of them, a senior officer named Captain Marshall, stepped forward, his expression grave but respectful. "Lieutenant Colonel Carter," he said, the title slipping from his lips naturally, as if it had always been meant for her. "Your father would be proud." Quinn nodded, her face still calm, though a flicker of emotion passed through her eyes. She had never sought attention. She had never asked for the spotlight, but the circumstances had forced her to step into it. The medal she carried, her father's legacy, had not only transformed her life but had also begun to reshape the Academy's perception of her. As Captain Marshall turned to address the other cadets, Quinn stepped aside. She had no desire for further recognition. The truth had been revealed, and that was enough. But even as she tried to step back into the shadows, her presence remained undeniable. The cadets, who had once seen her as nothing more than a lowly servant, now watched her with a mixture of awe and regret. The sneering faces that had mocked her mere hours ago were now replaced with expressions of respect, even fear. They knew, without a doubt, that Quinn was no longer someone to be underestimated. The Academy's commanding officers called for an emergency assembly. In the vast, marble-lined hall, the cadets gathered, their eyes nervously darting between the podium and Quinn. Colonel Davis's absence was felt immediately, his once towering presence now reduced to nothing more than a stain on the Academy's history. As the headmaster took the stage, he addressed the cadets. "We stand at a crossroads," he began, his voice steady but heavy with the weight of recent events. "Colonel Davis has been arrested for his crimes. His betrayal of this institution, of the men and women who have trusted him, will not be forgotten. But we must also acknowledge the actions of Lieutenant Colonel Carter." The room fell silent as the headmaster paused, his gaze moving over the cadets, settling on Quinn. She stood in the back, her posture straight and dignified, but she did not seek the attention that was now being forced upon her. "Lieutenant Colonel Quinn Carter," the headmaster continued, his voice growing more resolute. "You are the embodiment of honor. Today, you've shown us what it means to stand up for what's right, no matter the odds. Your courage, your integrity, these are qualities that this Academy will not forget." Quinn's heart pounded in her chest, but she did not allow it to show. She had expected the recognition, but it still felt surreal. She had never sought accolades, never imagined that her life would be defined by the actions of one fateful day. But here she was, a symbol of the very values she had been raised with. The headmaster's next words were even more surprising. "Effective immediately," he announced, "Lieutenant Colonel Quinn Carter will take command of the Cadet Training Division. Her experience, her leadership, and her moral compass make her the ideal candidate to guide the future of this institution." The room was still, and for a long moment, no one spoke. Then, a slow ripple of applause began. First from a few cadets, hesitant and unsure, but soon it grew until the entire room was clapping, not out of obligation, but because they understood the gravity of what had just occurred. Quinn Carter, the girl they had once laughed at, was now their leader. For a brief moment, Quinn allowed herself to feel the weight of it all. She had come from nothing, from being the invisible worker in the background, to standing at the forefront of this prestigious academy. She knew it wasn't just the medal that had earned her this place. It was her resolve, her quiet strength, and her unwillingness to bend in the face of adversity. As the applause died down, Quinn stepped forward. She took a deep breath, then addressed the cadets, her voice steady and commanding. "I didn't come here to lead you because of my father's name," she began, her words clear and powerful. "I came here because I believe in what this academy stands for. I believe in honor, in integrity, and in the strength of standing together. I will lead you with respect, and I will challenge each of you to become better, not just as soldiers, but as people." Her words, simple but profound, carried the weight of someone who had seen both sides of the coin. She wasn't just another cadet now. She wasn't just the daughter of a legend. Quinn Carter had earned her place. As the cadets stood before her, the respect in their eyes was undeniable. They had seen her as an outsider, a nobody, but now they knew the truth. Quinn Carter was a force to be reckoned with. The days that followed Quinn's appointment as the head of the Cadet Training Division were filled with an air of unease, a mixture of admiration and nervous anticipation from the cadets. The academy, once a place of rigid tradition and unchallenged authority, now had a new force to reckon with. Quinn's reputation as the daughter of General James Carter had already set the stage for her rise, but it was her character, her resolve, that began to truly shape the perception of those around her. In the weeks following Colonel Davis's arrest, Quinn's leadership style became evident. She wasn't one to rely on flashy speeches or grand gestures. Instead, she led by example. pushing her cadets to excel not just in physical endurance, but in the strength of their character. She demanded excellence, but not through fear or intimidation. Quinn believed that true leadership came from mutual respect and the shared goal of achieving something greater than oneself. Her days were spent in rigorous training sessions, where she would test the cadets' limits. But unlike Colonel Davis, who ruled with an iron fist and little regard for the individual, Quinn took time to understand each cadet's strengths and weaknesses. She saw potential where others saw flaws, and she nurtured it. Her methods weren't always popular, but they were effective. One morning, as the cadets lined up for their usual drills, Quinn stood at the front, her posture as impeccable as always. She surveyed the group with a piercing gaze, her eyes scanning for signs of hesitation, exhaustion, or doubt. There was no room for weakness in her academy, but she knew the fine line between pushing someone too hard and bringing out the best in them. "Today's drill will be different," Quinn announced, her voice cutting through the air. "We're not focusing on speed or strength. Today, we focus on teamwork, trust, communication, and unity." The cadets exchanged wary glances. They were used to being pushed to their physical limits, but this was a new kind of challenge. Quinn continued, her words firm but encouraging. "We will be split into teams. Your goal is simple: work together to complete a series of obstacles. Fail together, succeed together. No one is to finish alone. Understand?" The cadets nodded in unison, though many of them were still unsure of what to expect. This wasn't about personal achievement, this was about the collective. For many of them, that was a concept that was difficult to grasp. As the drill began, the obstacles were deceptively simple at first: crawling under barbed wire, scaling walls, running across uneven terrain. But as the day wore on, the challenges grew harder, pushing both their physical and mental limits. What was most difficult, however, was the constant reliance on their teammates. The cadets were used to competing against each other, each driven by the desire to be the best. But now, they were forced to rely on one another, to support each other's weaknesses and trust in each other's strengths. At one point, Peter, the same cadet who had once mocked Quinn, found himself struggling to lift a heavy log as part of a team challenge. His arms were trembling, sweat dripping down his face. It was a task he couldn't accomplish alone, and for the first time, he realized that the strength of the group mattered more than his individual achievements. Quinn, who had been observing from a distance, saw the hesitation in Peter's eyes. Without saying a word, she walked over, her presence commanding but not overbearing. "Lift with your legs, Peter. Push together, not alone," she said, her voice calm but firm. Peter hesitated, then nodded. He wasn't used to asking for help, but as the rest of his team gathered around him, they worked together to lift the log. It was a slow, exhausting effort, but they did it as a team. When the task was finally complete, Peter looked up at Quinn, his eyes filled with a mixture of respect and gratitude. "Thank you," he said quietly. Quinn simply nodded. "You did it together. That's what matters." The drill continued, and by the end of the day, the cadets were exhausted, physically, emotionally, and mentally. But there was a quiet sense of achievement in the air. They had learned something vital, that the success of the group depended on the success of the individual, and vice versa. Quinn had instilled in them the lesson that leadership wasn't just about command. It was about cooperation, trust, and shared responsibility. As the cadets filed out of the training yard, many of them exchanged thoughtful glances. They had come to understand something deeper than they had expected. Quinn's leadership style wasn't about showing off power or dominance. It was about lifting others up, pushing them to be better not for themselves, but for those they served alongside. But despite the strides she had made with her cadets, Quinn knew the road ahead would not be easy. Colonel Davis may have been removed from power, but his influence still lingered within the walls of the academy. There were whispers, unspoken tensions that she couldn't ignore. Some of the older officers, those who had once been loyal to Davis, viewed Quinn's rise with skepticism. They respected her father's legacy, but they were unsure whether a woman, especially one with no formal military experience, could lead them. And there were others, former supporters of Davis, who were now quietly plotting to regain control, to undermine Quinn's leadership and restore the old order. Quinn could feel the weight of this growing threat on the horizon, but she was not one to shy away from a challenge. For the first time since her arrival at the academy, Quinn allowed herself a brief moment of reflection. She was no longer just a girl with a famous last name. She was a leader, a force to be reckoned with. And whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them head-on, with the same quiet strength that had carried her through the most difficult moments of her life. As the sun set over the academy, casting long shadows across the training field, Quinn's resolve solidified. The battle for control of the academy had just begun, and she was ready to take it on, not as General James Carter's daughter, but as Lieutenant Colonel Quinn Carter. The days at Eastwood Military Academy grew more intense as Quinn's leadership continued to evolve. The cadets, once hesitant and uncertain of their place in her world, had begun to respect her, not just because of her father's name, but because of her actions, her integrity, and her unwavering commitment to the values of honor and teamwork. Yet, the academy, with its long history of tradition and influence, wasn't easily swayed. While Quinn's rise had been meteoric, not everyone had embraced the change. Behind closed doors, the older officers who had once pledged their loyalty to Colonel Davis were quietly seething. Colonel Davis's arrest had left a void, and some believed that the academy's leadership should revert to the old ways, the ones that had kept the cadets in line through fear and discipline. They saw Quinn's leadership style as weak, too reliant on emotion and personal connection, not the cold, hard discipline they valued. The whispers began to grow louder. Meetings were held in secret, and new alliances were formed. It wasn't long before Quinn realized that she was not just leading her cadets, she was leading a silent rebellion within the ranks of the academy itself. Her father's legacy was a double-edged sword. It had granted her the opportunity to rise to the top, but it also painted a target on her back. One afternoon, as Quinn stood in her office reviewing cadet performance reports, a knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. She looked up to see Captain Marshall standing in the doorway, his face serious. "Lieutenant Colonel Carter," he said, his tone laced with concern. "There's something you need to know." Quinn motioned for him to enter, her gaze never wavering. "What is it, Captain?" Marshall stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. He hesitated for a moment, as though weighing how to phrase his words carefully. Finally he spoke. "There are some cadets who are questioning your methods. They're not happy with the changes you've brought to the academy. Some are calling your leadership soft. They believe you're not what this institution needs." Quinn's eyes narrowed slightly, but she remained calm. She had suspected something like this was brewing, but hearing it confirmed made it all the more real. It wasn't just the cadets anymore. The older officers, those who had once stood beside Colonel Davis, were quietly sowing seeds of discontent among the ranks. "They're planning something," Marshall continued, his voice low. "Some of them are meeting in private. I don't know the full details, but they're trying to undermine you, to take back control of the academy." Quinn took a deep breath, her mind racing through the possibilities. She had known that change would come at a price, but this was more than she had expected. The academy was no longer a place of training. It was becoming a battleground, and Quinn was standing at the center of it. "I won't be intimidated," Quinn said, her voice steady. "We've worked too hard to let this place fall back into the hands of those who would ruin it." Marshall nodded, though there was a hint of doubt in his eyes. "I know you're strong, Lieutenant Colonel, but you need to be careful. Some of these men have power, connections, they won't go down without a fight." Quinn looked out the window, her thoughts momentarily drifting. She knew the storm was coming, but she wasn't about to back down. She had earned her place, and she would fight for it. For the first time in a long time, she could feel the weight of the decisions ahead of her, the tension growing with every passing day. That evening, Quinn convened a meeting with her most trusted officers, Captain Marshall, Lieutenant Harper, and Sergeant Williams. They sat around a table in her office, the room heavy with the weight of the conversation ahead. "I know there are forces at work here trying to undermine my leadership," Quinn began, her tone sharp and commanding. "We can't allow this to continue. We've come too far to let the academy fall back into old habits." Harper, a seasoned officer who had served with Quinn's father, looked at her with a mix of admiration and concern. "Lieutenant Colonel, we're with you. But we can't ignore the power some of these men hold. They won't give up easily. Quinn nodded, understanding the stakes. I know. But we have to make our move now. We need to solidify our position. If we let this go on much longer, we risk losing everything we've worked for. Sergeant Williams, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. What do you need us to do? Quinn met each of their gazes, her resolve hardening. We need to make sure the cadets remain loyal. We need to show them that we stand for something greater than personal ambition or old traditions. This isn't just about me. It's about this academy and the future we're shaping. Her officers nodded in agreement, and Quinn could see the determination in their eyes. This battle was far from over. The challenges ahead would test everything she had worked for, but she wasn't afraid. The next day, Quinn called for an all-cadet assembly. She stood before them in the academy's grand hall, her gaze sweeping over the hundreds of faces before her. The tension in the room was palpable, but Quinn wasn't intimidated. This was her moment to prove that her leadership was not just about bloodlines or reputation. It was about doing what was right, even in the face of opposition. Cadets, she began, her voice ringing through the hall. You've all been through a lot. We've all faced challenges together, and we've become stronger for it. But I want to be clear about something. The future of this academy does not lie in the past. It does not lie in the hands of those who would see us return to old ways of fear and corruption. She paused, letting her words sink in. The future lies with each of you, with your character, your honor, and your willingness to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard. I'm not here to be your enemy. I'm here to guide you, to lead you, and to ensure that this academy becomes everything it should be. But I need your loyalty. I need your support. For a long moment, the room was silent. Quinn could feel the weight of the cadets' gazes on her, could sense the unease that still lingered in some of them. But then, slowly, one by one, they began to clap. At first, it was hesitant, unsure. But as the claps grew louder, Quinn's heart swelled with pride. She had earned their respect. And with it, she would fight to protect the academy from the storm that was brewing.